Imagine standing trial, surrounded by your fellow citizens, accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. The jury finds you guilty. You are sentenced to death. Most people would beg for mercy, or at least tremble at the thought of the end. But not Socrates. He remained calm, even cheerful, and delivered one of the most powerful defenses of philosophy ever spoken. Why did Socrates not fear dying? That's what we'll explore today. Imagine the bustling city of Athens in the year 399 BCE. The air is thick with politics, gossip, and uncertainty. Athens, once the crown jewel of Greek democracy, is still recovering from its devastating defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The glory of Pericles is gone. Sparta has humbled the Athenians, and the city's pride has been wounded. In such a fragile climate, suspicion and resentment run high, especially toward anyone who questions authority or challenges the accepted ways of life. And here stands Socrates, a 70-year-old philosopher with a reputation for questioning everyone, from politicians to poets, craftsmen to generals. He never wrote a single book, never charged money for teaching, and never claimed to have wisdom. Instead, he asked questions that exposed contradictions, revealed ignorance, and left his opponents often embarrassed or angry. He described himself as a gadfly, stinging the lazy horse of Athens, keeping the city awake, restless, and alive. But while some admired his honesty, many more grew tired of his relentless criticism. The trial of Socrates began with three accusers: Meletus, a poet; Anytus, a powerful democratic politician; and Lycon, a rhetorician. Together they charged him with two crimes. First, impiety, or failing to believe in the gods of Athens. And second, corrupting the youth by teaching them to question authority and tradition. Behind these charges, however, lay a deeper resentment. Many Athenians associated Socrates with controversial figures, including some of the leaders of the recently fallen oligarchic regime known as the 30 Tyrants. Though Socrates himself never supported their brutality, the association made him an easy target in a city desperate to preserve its fragile democracy. Picture the courtroom, a large open space perhaps in the agora, filled with 500 jurors, ordinary male citizens chosen by lot. Unlike modern trials, there was no defense lawyer, no judge to ensure fairness. The accused had to speak for himself, and persuasion was everything. In this charged atmosphere, Socrates delivered his defense, later recorded by his student Plato in the dialogue known as the Apology. At the start of his speech, Socrates admitted something surprising. He would not flatter the jury. He would not beg for mercy, bring in his children to stir pity, or craft carefully rehearsed words. Instead, he would speak plainly, as he always had, guided by reason and truth. From the beginning, he made it clear his mission was not to save his life at any cost, but to defend the life of philosophy. Socrates reminded the jury of the oracle at Delphi, which had once declared that no man was wiser than Socrates. Perplexed, since he knew he possessed no special knowledge, Socrates went out to test the oracle's words. He questioned politicians, poets, and craftsmen, discovering that, while they claimed to know many things, their wisdom was superficial. By contrast, Socrates recognized his own ignorance. In this, he realized, lay a kind of wisdom, knowing that you do not know. This mission, to challenge pretended knowledge and encourage self-examination, was not a crime, but a service to the city. Still, his method earned him enemies. People, especially those with reputations to protect, disliked being exposed as ignorant. Worse, the young men of Athens followed him around, imitating his questioning style, sometimes mocking authority figures in public. This, his accusers argued, was corruption. To the charge of impiety, Socrates responded directly. How could he be accused of atheism when his whole life was guided by a divine inner voice, what he called his daemonian? This mysterious sign, he explained, was like a spiritual conscience, restraining him from wrong actions. Far from denying the divine, Socrates insisted that he was, in fact, profoundly religious, though not in the conventional way his accusers demanded. The trial was not simply about religion or education, it was about the freedom to question. Athens, birthplace of democracy, was now testing whether it could tolerate one of its most relentless critics. Would the city allow Socrates to continue stinging it awake, or would it silence him permanently? The jury voted. The margin was not huge, but it was enough. Socrates was found guilty. According to Athenian custom, after a guilty verdict, both sides proposed a punishment. The accusers asked for death. Socrates, in characteristic irony, first suggested that he deserved a reward: free meals for life in the Prytaneum, the hall where Olympic champions were honored. After laughter and outrage, he grew serious and proposed a modest fine. His friends, including Plato, offered to pay it, but the jury was unmoved. They condemned him to death by drinking hemlock. Here, most men would have collapsed, pleaded, or at least cursed their accusers. But Socrates remained composed. He told the jurors that, by killing him, they would not harm him but themselves, for silencing the voice of philosophy would leave the city poorer. He calmly reminded them that death, in itself, was not to be feared, because no one truly knew what death was. And with this, he set the stage for one of the most remarkable meditations on mortality in history. Socrates' philosophy of death. Socrates' reflections on death, preserved in Plato's Apology, stand as some of the most radical words ever spoken in a courtroom. At the moment when his life hung in the balance, he chose not to appeal to emotion, but to reason. Instead of fearing death, he explained why it was irrational to do so. Let us consider his central argument. Socrates begins with a question: why should we fear death? The common answer is obvious. Death is the end, the loss of everything we know. But Socrates challenges this assumption. To fear death, he argues, is to claim knowledge we do not have. And if there is one thing Socrates insists upon, it is that human beings should not pretend to know what they do not. We fear death, he says, as if we knew it to be the greatest of evils. But in reality, no man knows whether death may not be the greatest of goods. This is a classic Socratic reversal. What most people take for granted, that death is terrible, he flips into a puzzle. Perhaps it is not terrible at all. Perhaps, in fact, it may be something positive. And since we cannot know, it is foolish to treat death as an evil. Socrates then offers two possibilities for what death could be. The first, death is like a deep, dreamless sleep. Imagine, he says, the most peaceful night of rest you have ever had, one without dreams, one where you wake feeling completely refreshed. If death is like this, then it is a blessing, for all of time would pass in a single instant, without pain, fear, or longing. Compared to the struggles, anxieties, and injustices of life, such rest would be welcome. The second possibility: death is not an end, but a transition, a journey to another place where the soul continues to exist. And if that is true, then imagine the joy of meeting and conversing with the great figures of the past. Socrates imagines encountering Homer, Hesiod, and Odysseus, questioning them as he questioned his fellow Athenians. For a philosopher, this would be the ultimate reward, an eternal symposium of souls, where truth could be pursued without end. In either case, peaceful sleep or continued dialogue, death holds no terror for the wise. Underlying this argument is Socrates' conviction that the true value of life lies not in its length, but in its quality. To live well is to live justly, honestly, and in pursuit of truth. If a longer life requires betraying these values, if it means abandoning philosophy, submitting to ignorance, or compromising integrity, then life itself loses its worth. Death, by contrast, cannot touch the soul's virtue. It can only end the body. Thus, the philosopher has no reason to fear it. This reasoning ties directly into his most famous statement: the unexamined life is not worth living. What gives life its value is reflection, inquiry, the search for wisdom. Death is frightening only if life is measured by wealth, pleasure, or power, things which death can take away. But if life is measured by the state of the soul, then death cannot harm what is most important. In this sense, Socrates demonstrates not resignation, but liberation, freedom from the tyranny of fear. Notice also the radical humility in his approach. Unlike religious teachers who claim certainty about an afterlife, Socrates does not insist on knowing what comes after death. He does not describe heavens or hells, rewards or punishments. He simply admits ignorance. And yet, in that ignorance, he finds peace. Because if we cannot know, then it is unreasonable to fear. The unknown need not be terrifying. It can also be a space of possibility, even of hope. This perspective had profound consequences. By refusing to fear death, Socrates deprived his accusers of their power. The threat of execution, meant to silence him, became meaningless. He showed that philosophy, love of wisdom, was stronger than the fear of mortality. In his calm acceptance, he transformed what could have been a humiliating defeat into a timeless victory. His death, paradoxically, secured his immortality, inspiring Plato and generations of thinkers after him. For us today, Socrates' attitude raises pressing questions. How much of our lives is shaped by fear of death? How often do we compromise our integrity, our curiosity, or our values in the hope of clinging to safety? Socrates challenges us to live differently, not recklessly, but bravely, with the understanding that mortality is inevitable, and that what matters most is not how long we live, but how well we live. One of the most enduring lines from Socrates' trial is also one of the most radical. The unexamined life is not worth living. Spoken to the jury after his conviction, this statement was not just a clever phrase. It was the heart of his philosophy, and a declaration of why he did not fear death. For most Athenians, life was measured by wealth, reputation, political influence, or family legacy. To die was to lose these things, and therefore death was the greatest misfortune. But Socrates rejected this view. To him, the value of life was not external, but internal. Life was worthwhile only if it was lived with reflection, with questioning, with a constant search for truth and virtue. So when the jury asked him to propose an alternative punishment to death, Socrates did not offer exile or silence. He insisted he could never stop philosophizing, because a life without philosophy, without examination, was worse than death itself. What good would it do to survive if survival meant betraying the very purpose of living. This statement struck his audience like a thunderbolt. Imagine being told that most people's lives, busy with daily concerns, political debates, and material pursuits, were essentially not worth living. It was a challenge, a provocation, even an insult. Yet Socrates meant it sincerely. He had discovered that the pursuit of wisdom was the only thing that gave life its true value. And if Athens demanded that he abandon this pursuit, then death was preferable. Think about the courage behind this idea. Most of us cling to life instinctively, even if it means compromise. But Socrates declared that living without reflection is a kind of spiritual death, a hollow existence. Better to face physical death with integrity than to live without meaning. His words transformed death from an enemy into a test of authenticity. By standing firm, he showed that philosophy was not just a pastime, it was a way of life and a way of dying. In that moment, Socrates gave us one of the boldest redefinitions of human purpose. Life is not about survival at all costs, but about living rightly, even if it costs us everything. After his trial, Socrates was held in prison, awaiting execution. His friends, devastated by the verdict, quickly devised a plan to help him escape. Athens was not an impenetrable fortress. Bribes could be paid, guards could be persuaded, safe havens could be found. Many citizens had fled exile before. Why shouldn't Socrates do the same? Surely, they thought, philosophy needed him alive more than dead. Plato recounts this episode in the dialogue Crito. In it, Socrates' wealthy friend Crito visits him in prison at dawn, urging him to escape. Crito argues passionately. Socrates' death would be a tragedy, not only for him, but for his family and followers. People would say his friends abandoned him. Moreover, by staying, Socrates would be allowing his enemies to triumph. He would be committing an injustice against himself, something he had always opposed. But Socrates listened calmly and then explained why he would not flee. To understand his reasoning, we must recall his principle. It is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. If he were to escape, he argued, he would be breaking the very laws of Athens that had nurtured him all his life. Even if the verdict was unjust, undermining the law would be an even greater injustice, one that corrupted his own soul. To make this clear, Socrates personifies the laws, imagining them speaking to him. By attempting to destroy us, you destroy the city. All your life you have enjoyed the protection and benefits of our order, education, citizenship, stability. And now, when it suits you, you would throw us aside? No, Socrates. You must either persuade us or obey us. To run away is to betray both justice and philosophy. In this dialogue, we see Socrates' integrity in its purest form. He valued principle over life. To escape would not just be illegal, it would contradict everything he had taught. He would be proving his enemies right. That philosophy was only clever words, not a true commitment. By staying, by submitting to the law, even in injustice, he embodied the consistency between belief and action. Crito, and perhaps Plato himself, struggled with this decision. From a practical view, it seemed absurd. Why sacrifice such a mind, such a teacher? But Socrates refused compromise. To him, philosophy was not about convenience. It was about truth, justice, and coherence of the soul. If death was the price of integrity, so be it. Thus, Socrates remained in prison, awaiting the cup of hemlock, showing once more that death was not the worst fate. The worst fate was betrayal of principle. At the heart of Socrates' defiance lies a profound lesson about fear itself. For most people, fear of death is natural, instinctive, unavoidable. But Socrates approached fear the way he approached everything else, with reason, with questions, with philosophy. Why do we fear death? Because we think we know it is bad. But that, he argued, is ignorance disguised as knowledge. To fear death is to assume certainty where none exists. A philosopher must resist such assumptions. By admitting ignorance, I do not know what death is, Socrates freed himself from fear's grip. But his attitude toward fear went deeper. Socrates believed fear itself is corrupting. It leads us to compromise justice, to abandon reason, to cling to illusions. In the trial, he declared, "A man who is good for anything ought not to calculate the chance of living or dying. He ought only to consider whether what he is doing is right or wrong. Fear of death distracts us from the real question of morality. What matters is not how long we live, but how rightly we live." This was not bravado. Socrates did not deny the pain of dying or the sorrow of leaving loved ones behind. What he denied was its power to make him abandon philosophy. Fear could not dictate his actions. He placed integrity above survival. In this way, Socrates redefined courage. For him, courage was not rashness nor suppression of fear, but the ability to live guided by reason and justice despite fear. True wisdom lay in recognizing the limits of our knowledge, and true courage lay in acting rightly in the face of uncertainty. Death was uncertain, but virtue was within our control. Therefore, a wise man fears not death, but corruption of the soul. This radical view inspired generations after him. The Stoics, who taught that fear of death is the root of slavery. Early Christians who saw in Socrates a model of martyrdom. And modern thinkers who find in him a call to authenticity. His serenity in the face of death was not indifference. It was the triumph of philosophy over fear. The death of Socrates was not the end of his philosophy. It was the beginning of his immortality. In the centuries that followed, his calm acceptance of death became a beacon for thinkers, poets, and statesmen, shaping the very foundations of Western thought. Plato, his devoted student, recorded the trial and the final conversations in works like the Apology, Credo, and Phaedo. Without these texts, Socrates' voice might have been lost forever, for he himself never wrote a word. Plato transformed the trial into a drama of ideas, a moment where philosophy proved itself stronger than politics, stronger even than death. For Plato, Socrates' refusal to fear death was proof that the soul is more enduring than the body and that truth itself cannot be executed. Later thinkers took inspiration in different ways. The Stoics, like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, saw Socrates as a model of courage and rationality. They echoed his teaching that death is not an evil, but a natural event, beyond our control, and therefore unworthy of fear. For them, as for Socrates, the only true evil is the corruption of one's character. Even early Christian writers looked to Socrates as a kind of pre-Christian martyr. They admired how he bore false accusations, unjust condemnation, and death itself with serenity, all for the sake of truth. Justin Martyr, one of the earliest defenders of Christianity, called Socrates a forerunner to Christ, a man who suffered for righteousness and exposed the emptiness of false gods. Beyond philosophy and religion, Socrates' death also shaped the very idea of intellectual freedom. His trial has been remembered as one of history's great miscarriages of justice, alongside the persecutions of Galileo or the imprisonment of dissidents in more recent times. Whenever truth-tellers are silenced by the state, the story of Socrates echoes as a warning. A society that kills its thinkers kills part of its own soul. And yet, Socrates' example continues to inspire not despair, but hope. His death showed that ideas cannot be destroyed by force. A city may execute a man, but it cannot execute wisdom. In choosing to face death without fear, Socrates planted the seed of a tradition that values truth over comfort, justice over safety, and integrity over survival. That seed has grown for more than 2,000 years, and it still bears fruit today. Why should we, living in the 21st century, care about a man who died more than 2,400 years ago? Because the fear of death and the struggle to live meaningfully in its shadow remains one of the most universal human challenges. Socrates' response to mortality is as relevant now as it was in ancient Athens. Consider the way fear shapes modern life. People spend fortunes on anti-aging treatments, health fads, or technologies promising to extend life indefinitely. We avoid conversations about mortality, treating death as a taboo. In medicine, we often see extraordinary measures taken to prolong life, sometimes at the expense of dignity. Fear of death lurks behind much of our anxiety, driving us to distraction, consumption, or denial. Socrates offers an alternative perspective. Instead of fleeing death, he invites us to think about it rationally. If death is like dreamless sleep, why fear it? If it is a passage to another existence, why not approach it with curiosity? And if it is simply inevitable, then why not focus on what we can control, the quality of our living? In a world anxious about mortality, Socrates' calm reasoning is profoundly liberating. His philosophy also challenges us in our ethical lives. How often do people compromise their principles out of fear? Fear of losing a job, fear of standing out, fear of conflict, fear of punishment. Socrates reminds us that integrity is more valuable than survival. The question is not, how long will I live? But, am I living rightly? This perspective has empowered countless activists, reformers, and ordinary individuals who chose to speak the truth even when it endangered them. Take, for example, doctors in crisis zones who remain with their patients despite life-threatening risks, or whistleblowers who expose corruption knowing they may lose everything. These modern figures embody the Socratic spirit, choosing justice and truth over fear. They demonstrate, as Socrates did, that living in fear is a kind of slow death, while living with integrity brings freedom, even in the face of mortality. Socrates' attitude can also reshape personal life. Instead of fearing the end, we can use the awareness of death as motivation. Knowing life is finite encourages us to live deliberately, to examine our values, and to focus on what matters most: relationships, learning, virtue. Death, rather than being an enemy, becomes a teacher, reminding us to live fully and wisely. In this way, Socrates speaks across the centuries. Fear not the end, but a wasted life. Death is certain, but meaning is chosen. The question is not whether we will die, but whether we will live examined lives before we do. As Socrates awaited his execution, he spoke calmly to his friends, reasoning about the soul, about virtue, about death itself. When the time came, he drank the hemlock without trembling, without bitterness, and lay down to meet the end with serenity. His final words were a reminder to repay a debt to Asclepius, the god of healing, suggesting that death itself was a kind of cure, a release from the ailments of mortal life. More than 2,000 years later, his example still resonates. Socrates shows us that death need not be feared, because it is either a peaceful sleep or a new journey. He shows us that integrity is more valuable than mere survival, and that a life without reflection is worse than death itself. He shows us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate our actions. But above all, he shows us how to live, to question, to examine, to seek wisdom humbly, to align our actions with our values, even when the cost is high, to remember that the true measure of a life is not how long it lasts, but how deeply it engages with truth and justice. As we reflect on his death, we are invited to reflect on our own lives. How do we respond to the inevitability of mortality? Do we hide from it, fear it, or try to deny it? Or can we, like Socrates, use it as a compass, guiding us toward authenticity and courage? Perhaps the reason Socrates did not fear dying was because he had already learned how to live. His life was a continual examination, a daily practice of philosophy, a constant commitment to truth. By the time death arrived, he was prepared. His soul was uncorrupted, his mission fulfilled. For him, death was not a defeat, but a final act of coherence. So when we ask, why did Socrates not fear death? The answer is not just about death, it is about life. To live rightly, to live examined, to live with courage. That is to live in such a way that death loses its sting. And that is the lesson Socrates leaves for us all.